Welcome to the podcast, Your Future in Sales and Marketing, the podcast that helps you make great career decisions. My name is Mike Dixon, and I'm a professional sales and marketing recruiter. I love what I do, but my biggest frustration is seeing too many people not realizing their career potential. In this podcast, I'll introduce you to my network, an amazing group of business leaders from the biggest tier 1 organizations through to some super fast growth SMEs. They'll share their career journeys and give unique advice and insights on managing your career and leading a function and a business. Join me, Mike Dixon of AXR Recruitment and Search, to help guide your future in sales and marketing. Well, hello and welcome to the podcast, Your Future in Sales and Marketing, with me, Mike Dixon, Director of AXR Recruitment and Search. Our purpose at AXR is to equip you with everything you need to make a great career decision. Our podcast guests feature the good, the great, the fun, and the quirky from the world of Aussie leadership in the consumer world. We explore the career that took them to senior leadership. We then dive into their current leadership role and eke out some great career advice to help you. In today's pod, we have Tim York, CEO of V2 Foods, a trailblazer in the plant-based protein sector. Hi, Tim. Welcome to the pod.
Thanks, Mike. How are you?
I'm very well, mate. Very well. I'm really looking forward to this chat. We've known each other for a while, and I've followed your career with great interest. So I'm looking forward to getting into the detail and letting all the listeners get to know you better as well. So with that in mind, our usual icebreakers, Tim, what's your favorite brand? And you've got to pick one that you haven't worked on.
Probably Apple.
Apple, any reason?
Oh, I just think they've got a great product proposition.
Yeah, agreed. I think the rest of the world will probably, most of the world will agree with you there.
Except for maybe China.
Maybe. And where are you from? What's your background?
Yes, I grew up in country Queensland in a place called Dalby, which is about 2 hours west of Brisbane.
Right. What's Dalby like?
It was a great place to grow up. So I grew up on a 2,000-acre beef cattle farm.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Good. I did not know that. Good knowledge. Okay.
Yeah, so one of the few to go from beef to plant-based, but we'll talk about that later today.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, and this podcast is called Your Future in Sales and Marketing, but your career didn't start in either function. So you were an engineer originally, then a management consultant. So kind of take us through the early years and how engineering and consulting kind of created this platform for you.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and we'll come to it later on in the chat, but there was really only one conversation I had maybe 20 years ago, which if that hadn't happened, I probably would never have got into sales and marketing. But yeah, no, I started life as an engineer. I did mechanical engineering at University of Queensland. Post that, I got a job with Honeywell, which is a big industrial automation company out of the US. Worked for them for a couple of years and then joined Amcor, and had a pretty traditional industrial engineering role with them, which was really focused on how do you make things better, faster, cheaper. Started in a very small factory making if you remember the old Ajax cardboard can, moved from that into their aerosols business. And then over a period of 4 years, ended up sort of having a divisional role looking at sort of continuous improvement across the metals group, which is sort of paint cans, food cans, aerosol cans, beverage cans, etc.
Great. And I'm curious as the consulting piece, because you can get into consulting, EY, Capgemini, and then this, into this MBM role at CCA. Now we talk in the pod and have done a lot around diverse career paths. I love it, and I think the more diverse the better in terms of creating leaders of the future. But yours is pretty much out there.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it in disparate parts, it does sound like a whole lot of different silos. But the thing that really unites it all for me is problem solving. So like the stuff I was doing at Amcor was very nuts and bolts problem solving. When I got into management consulting, it was more around strategy and profit improvement. But again, you're still solving problems, and there's a hypothesis on what may or may not happen. You've got to understand what you can and can't do and how to move the needle to improve it. So like it does all effectively join together to me in terms of I'm pretty good at problem solving.
Yeah.
The MBN role, because even when I left consulting, when I moved into Coke, I actually went back to an ops role again. So I first joined Coke really helping with the operations strategy piece in terms of what were the new capabilities and capacities that the network needed in Australia and the ops function. From there, I moved across and joined the new product development team, which was sort of more of an interface role between finance and brand and supply chain in terms of what were the things that we should be doing new, what would it cost to get into them, was the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak, in terms of getting into those new things. And it was really only in a career conversation with Warwick White, who ran the Australian Coke business for a number of years. And he suggested to me that rounding out my career with a sales role would be a really good thing, given that Coke is effectively a sales and distribution business in Australia. And I was prepared to take that challenge on. And at the time, the role that was available was to be the NBN for the Metcash business. So sort of my first sales role was sort of running a $100 to $200 million business. And it was definitely a baptism of fire, but I loved it. It was really good.
Yeah, complex, the Metcash world, multi-layered, lots of moving parts, lots of problems to solve, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Again, but fascinating the pathway into sales. And if you move forward in your career, the next kind of, I guess, fork in the road was becoming a CEO of an early stage business, Unistraw. So the business, some people will know, some people won't, but maybe give us a sense of Unistraw as an organization. But how did that happen, and what was your mandate as CEO?
Yeah, so for people that may remember, there was a brand called 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐿, and it was a milk flavouring straw product, and that was sort of an intellectual property-based product where we had a patent, and it was a drinking straw with a filter at either end, and then it was filled with lots of little dissolvable beads. And if you're a child, you put it into a glass of white milk and you drank through it, and it turned it into chocolate milk. So it was a really unique and interesting thing. But if you just think about my career at that point, like I'd never worked for a business that was less than probably $1 billion in revenue. In fact, Amatil was probably the smallest company I'd worked for. And then I had one of my ex-Ernst & Young clients reached out to me and suggested it would be a great career opportunity for me. And I just thought he was nuts, if I'm honest. It's a crazy idea. I've never worked in a startup. It just didn't feel like me. And I went and met Martin Chimes, who was the founder or the chairman of that business. And he was a very persuasive guy. And I can remember sitting down thinking I was doing him a courtesy to have the chat because someone who I'd worked with had asked me to have it. And I walked away really intrigued in the opportunity. And there was a couple of things he said to me that day that really resonated with me. One was, Tim, you've clearly got a great career. You can do great things at Coke, but when stuff happens there, you're never going to know if it's you. You're never going to know it's the guy before you that set it up for you, or the 100 people that set it up before you. Whereas what he was offering me is a white sheet of paper and the chance to build it from scratch. And so that was really appealing. And then he started to explain to me what it was like to work in a startup and how you would get an equity piece and what that could look like. So you start to get attracted to this huge carrot that you think might happen. And then the third thing to it, he just looked at me and went, Tim, where is your downside? Like, honestly, you can go and do this. And if you're good at it and we win, it's going to be amazing for your career and amazing for you financially. And if it doesn't, why don't you just go and get a job with another big FMCG company? Like, he really couldn't understand the risk. And when you do work with serial entrepreneurs, you see they actually don't really see the downside, whereas people that have worked in big FMCG all their life are typically much more risk averse than those guys. So anyway, out of all of that, I can remember having a big thought process on whether I would do it or not. And in the end, I decided to do it. I can remember resigning at Coke, and I think probably 10% of people were thinking that was a great idea. And I reckon 90% of people thought I was nuts as I walked out of the business. But I have no regrets. And it was probably one of the best career decisions that I think I've ever made.
I love that philosophy and decision-making process. So often we work at 𝐓𝐢𝐦 with some of the large tier ones, but we also work with some really interesting, high-risk, fast-growth, smaller businesses. And sometimes the process individuals go through to make the move is torturous. But actually, it's a line I use as well. What's the downside?
Yeah.
You can create an experience that whether it succeed or fail it's going to help you.
Yeah.
And if you don't like it, go back. Yeah, you aren't giving up your entire career by making a decision to go to something that's higher risk.
Yeah, I think there's a time in your career where you can probably take more risk and probably time when you can't. Like I was probably 5 at the time. And
Yeah.
to be honest, that's probably a good time to make those sorts of risks because if it doesn't work out, you've got more than enough time to recover.
Yeah.
Equally, you've sort of built a pretty cool toolkit of skills with the big guys, which you can then leverage.
There's value in you. Yeah. That's good advice, listeners. So thanks for that, Tim. Your exit from Unistraw, I mean, did was it successful? Did it work for you in the way that you hoped?
It definitely wasn't a linear journey. So if I just unpack that for you, like at the start, it was rockstar successful. So we first got the product ranged in the Happy Meal with McDonald's, and that was during the Peter Bush era at McDonald's. From there, we got invited to take the product to the McDonald's convention in Orlando. And I can remember walking the floor there and just meeting McDonald's people from all around the world. And out of that, we ended up getting it ranged in about 15 countries with McDonald's.
Wow.
In a 2-year period, we ended up having distribution in about 60 countries, which, to be honest, there's not too many Australian startups that could claim that. I think in 7 years, we did 1 billion serves of product. We were the fastest growing emerging export company at the time. And I remember meeting Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister, and winning an award for that. So it was really cool. And then the GFC happened and it all fell apart.
Yeah.
And you sort of sit there and say, well, why would the GFC affect a business like that? So we were selling in 60 countries. You've got to have financial instruments to guarantee payments, whether it be a letter of credit or a bank guarantee. And there was just a moment in time where all those financial instruments and risk just was off the table. And we went from selling in 60 countries to about 10 over a period of 6 months. And the business went from hyper growth to shrinking. I think we were burning $1 million a month once that all happened. And you learn a lot in those tough times. Like I have to say, I learned growing companies is a lot more fun than shrinking companies. and I learned you've just got to fight. Like you've got everyone in your team looking at you like, are we going to survive? Are we going to meet payroll? Are we going to, and it's a really high pressure environment. And I think when you go through those tough times, you learn a lot of grit, and like it definitely made me a better leader long term, but I definitely didn't enjoy that piece. And then we turned it around. So we shrunk the company. We got it back to being profitable. We did a deal with Bright Dairies in China, which was a really nice piece of work for us. And then we did a deal with Danone in the Middle East to license it to about, I think, 8 countries there. And that got us profitable again. But we just never really recovered the momentum we had before it. So it was a great journey. We ended up selling the company in 2012. So there definitely was an exit to it, but it definitely wasn't linear. And I think what I have learned through life is it never is.
Yeah. It's interesting context. And so it wasn't retirement and sailing off into the sunset, unfortunately.
I definitely felt it was at the start, Mike, but it didn't turn out that way. No.
And with that in mind, back to CCA, stability and was that kind of just of the moment, of the time, the right thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I've worked out through sort of thinking about this podcast before we turned up today is it's a lot of my career is more sliding door moments than plan. And I'm not sure if that's true of most people that sit in this chair, but it certainly was for me. I can just remember Steve Micken actually from Coke reached out to me and mentioned that they were looking for someone who had more of an entrepreneurial background to come into Coke and help with some innovation projects. So that was the start of me going back to Coke. And then I really enjoyed my first time there. And the reason I'd left was because this Unistraw opportunity had come up. So there was really, I felt like there was some unfinished business. And the guy I was going to work for was a guy called Vince Paneri, who I really rate as one of the better or best people leaders that I'd sort of seen in the Coke world. So I wanted to come and work for him. But when I came back, it didn't take long for me to realize it probably wasn't the right move. And I stayed for 3 years. And I enjoyed the time I was there, but like at Unistraw, I was sort of the captain of a jet ski, whereas I went back to being crew on the Titanic, and it's just a different fit. So ultimately, I was keen to find something that would be more entrepreneurial again. And And probably the other reason I left Coke was I was at a level where I was reporting to the executive team of the Australian business, but it was really hard to see a road to get from where I was to the executive team, because Coke is a super deep functional business. Like, if you're going to be the sales director, you've probably done 20 plus years of sales in Coke, and you've done everything from merchandising to a district sales manager to running big accounts. And so it'd be very hard for me to get that chair. And then equally in operations, I'm pretty good at ops as well, but I'm not at the same level as some of the best guys in Coke. Like, there are guys that have just run, 1,000 people teams on very big factories. So I didn't really see that my background was going to get me to that next level. I also thought if I went to something smaller and mid-size, I'd have a lot more fun. And so that's where the Darryl Lee opportunity came up.
Which brings us into a really interesting period. That's where I got to know you, Tim. And I remember the move very well, because for our listeners, to give some context, Darryl Lee is now, but certainly was at the time, this extraordinary brand which had fallen really hard. Give us an idea of what you joined.
So, to give some context to that. So Darryl Lee was a high street retail brand, which was probably revenue of around a bit over 100 million when it went bankrupt. And at the time it went bankrupt, it was losing, I think, somewhere between $5 and $10 million a year. So it wasn't a healthy business. The Quinn family out of Queensland bought it out of receivership, and they took the physical assets, the sites, and the brand. And then they left the retail stores with the administrators to shut down, because they just wanted to run it as a manufacturing business. And they immediately moved it into Metcash and then quickly into Woolies, Coles. And it had a pretty healthy non-grocery business in newsagents, chemists and Australia Post stores. So when I joined, it was back to being profitable. So the Quinns had very quickly worked out where the things were working.
Super fast. That was within months, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Quinns don't muck around. They're fast.
Yeah.
So that got done. When I joined, it was a profitable business, but a small business. So it was probably circa 40, 50 million in revenue. And I didn't know the Quinns. I just applied for a job through Seek, and I got to meet. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay. And I got to meet Tony, and then Rex Devantier is one of Tony's key lieutenants, and Clark Quinn, who was running the business as sort of the hands-on manager at the time. And I think the combination of my Coke experience, but also my uni store experience, helped me get that job, because they wanted someone who knew how to run a potentially big business in the future, but they wanted someone who'd get their hands dirty and roll their sleeves up and do the hard work that business needed. So that was it.
Wow. I applied to role and seek. There we are, guys. We would have thought. But and when you kind of got the Quinn family, you said they move quickly, they don't mess around. As the CEO, does that create just enormous pressure from day one, or actually is it, hey, you're in, we trust you, off you go now?
Both, I think. Yeah, I mean, when I joined, sort of the real guidance Tony gave me was, Tim, you got to grow this to $100 million. If you're under $100 million, you don't mean enough to enough people. And so just get it to 100 million. And in terms of how we'd get there was sort of left to me. But I mean, Tony was a pretty hands-on guy at the start, because obviously I was a new person into the business, and he wanted to make sure I knew what I was doing before he stepped back. But I found Tony's a tough operator. And for those that know him, he's a pretty colourful language guy and very hands-on. But I really liked his style. Like, he was the most decisive person I've ever worked for. And like, you didn't sit down with Tony and do 100 PowerPoint slides. Like, you'd literally, in a coffee conversation, say, this is the problem, this is what I want to do to fix it. And whether the fix was $1 million asset purchase or a $10 million asset purchase, like, those decisions could be made before the coffee was drunk. And so he was a really urgent sort of let's get stuff going kind of guy. And that's what Darryl Lee needed. Like, Darryl Lee was a business that needed a lot of work, and he was, to be honest, a perfect owner for that business. Where
did you get the business to, Tim?
Yeah, so at the time I left, it was probably about 5 times bigger than when I joined.
Yeah. That's, and when you're on a journey that fast, do you kind of enjoy the moment, or is it just there's no time? You're just running so quickly?
Oh, no, you do. I mean, we had a lot of fun. It was, so as you say, growing a business from 50 to 250 million, like the things we did to do that was, let's grow into the US, and we went across and got our products ranged into Kroger and Walmart. We bought a business in New Zealand. Nestle was divesting a lot of confectionery brands. So we bought Lifesavers and a number of other brands from them. And we ended up sort of broadening the product set to get into healthy snacking. Got into protein products and the like. So there was just so much that we did. And at the same time, we built a great team of people. By the time I left, I think the caliber of our sales, marketing, supply chain operations, product development team was as good as anyone. And we had to front up every day and beat people like Cadbury, Nestle, Mars. So they're not insignificant people that you've got to try and take share of. So the whole thing was really fun. I'm probably most proud of the team that we built. But it was just a great business. And the Quins saw it when they bought it. It was a business that had good bones. It had a household brand. It was iconic in Australia, and it had really good products. It had just got a bit daggy. The packaging had been left behind, and just the market had evolved with people like Linton and others coming into the market. So it became a much more sophisticated market here, and they really just hadn't really responded to that. And it needed a good strategy, but it needed a capital structure that could really unlock that. And the Quins were brilliant for that. And then later it got sold to Quadrant Private Equity. They were also brilliant owners because they were prepared to invest behind good ideas. And you need good people. And so if you get the right strategy, the right capital structure and good people, you can sort of do anything.
Yeah, well, seriously, great job. I loved, seeing the business grow and just watching the agitation in the category. It must have been, while it's tough for you going up against Nestle's and Mars and of this world, but a lot of fun as well. They must have hated you.
To be honest, we were growing a few million off their $1 billion P&L, so I'm not sure how much attention they were paying us, but certainly we enjoyed it.
Yeah, good. And let's bring this up to date. So you're CEO of V2 Foods. Now, some people might not know the business, so just give us your elevator pitch.
Right. I'll start with the category. So there's a couple of reasons why plant-based meats become a thing globally. So between now and 2050, the population is going to go from 8 billion to 10 billion people. And if you think about people's protein consumption, in China today, people eat about 30 kilos of meat a year. In Hong Kong, same genetics, same people, they're eating 150, not dissimilar to Australians or Americans. And if you do the math on the population growth, and if people start eating more protein as their sort of countries get richer, you need twice as much protein as we have today. And the reality is there's just not enough land, water, everything to do that. So you need to find a different way to feed the planet. And then when you come to things like carbon neutrality and people wanting to get there by 2050, about a quarter of all the greenhouse gases in the world come from food. But if you break that down, 80% of those greenhouse gases come from animal products. So if you want to really impact climate change and you want to reduce CO2 production, you have to address food. And if you're going to address food, you have to address meat and dairy. So that's the category promise. Then when you talk about V2 is a really interesting sort of origination story. So Jack Cowan from Hungry Jack's was wanting to get into plant-based for his restaurants. There wasn't an offer in Australia at that point in time. He happened to be sitting with someone from the CSIRO and a conversation was started. They had coincidentally done a lot of research in this space. And so sort of that was the inflection point that started the creation of V2 Food. And it's a really complex technical challenge because you've got to try and make plants look, cook, and taste like meat. And it's not an easy thing. You got to get the flavor right. You got to get the texture right. You got to get the fat systems right. You got to get the color right. And each one of those is a huge intellectual problem. And so it's been great to work with people like the CSIRO to solve that.
What an interesting picture you paint on the reality of the world we're living in. And it's quite simple to get it, and therefore understand the role the category plays and the role V2 can play. But the world is complicated, right? So it's the path to that point isn't going to be easy. Running the business, a commercial business, to do that, how do you kind of manage the expectations of the investors, the people that are working for you and believing in that journey versus all those kind of moving parts you got around you?
Yeah, sure. So I guess you've got to just first understand the investor that you're dealing with in that space. So if you're working on an ASX business, you've really got to talk about, are you going to hit this quarter? If you're working in private equity, it's typically, are you going to get there in 3 to 5 years in terms of what the sort of investment thesis is? In VC, it's a longer time horizon. So like we're really working with investors where you're looking at a 5 to 10 year play. And when you think about that time horizon, you are then dealing with a long period of time and a lot of ambiguity. And so therein lies some of the challenge. But if to win long term, like that's really simple. Like we've got to taste as good as beef. We've got to be the same price or cheaper than beef. We've got to have the same or better nutrition than beef. And then obviously we've got the inherent sustainability advantage. So when I'm looking at, are we going to win long term, it's really looking across those metrics and are we achieving those goals? But you've got to survive and get to the long term. So that's where you've got to have a capital structure that allows that to happen. You've got to have a cash burn rate that's under control, so you're not going to run out of money before the opportunity materializes. So it's certainly complex, but you know, we sort of run a long game and a short game. And I think that the long game, when I look at it now versus 2 years ago, hasn't really changed. Like we still have the same view that the end state is what it always was going to be. But the short term has been harder, and I guess there's more recognition now at how hard it is to move the consumer. And when you think about what you eat, Mike, for dinner now versus a year ago versus 10 years ago, it's probably not that different. And so getting consumers to change, maybe it is different.
I'm trying to think what, yeah, maybe.
We're so habit driven. Humans are so habit driven. So like it could even be a generational change that's needed. We definitely see millennials are much more focused on the category value prop than older Australians, but like it is across the board. You are seeing people make change, but it's not going to happen overnight. And I think you've got to remember people have been eating meat for thousands of years. To do this sort of change it's going to take time.
As you're talking, I'm thinking through my last decade of diet.
Yeah.
I reckon the evolution in my diet's probably come from my kids, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
And them pushing us, my wife and I, to buy different things, to broaden the diet, try, be more conscious of planet, if I'm honest. So you're probably right. It's probably coming from the next generation coming through. Yeah,
that's right. And that's one of our marketing team's insights is you want to get into millennials and Gen Z's diet. And the best way to do that is through Gen X people who are cooking for those generations. So it is a bit of a sort of a virtuous cycle that you're trying to fuel.
Yeah. That's a complex marketing problem.
It is.
To deal with. I can hear the marketers on the podcast, listeners that kind of going, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's different to my category.
I'm open to ideas, anyone out there.
Yeah. Okay. Contact me first, guys. I'll put you in touch with Tim. So the measures of success are different, right? In terms of VC bet, longer term horizon, which is great.
Sure.
Does that flow through to your role as a CEO in terms of what you're measured on? Does it feel like a different set of KPIs at V2, for example, to Darren Lee?
Yeah, it is same, but different. It is ultimately you're growing shareholder value. So, the shareholder value in V2 is going to be based on our revenue today, but more importantly, where it's going to get to. The growth rate's super important because if you're not achieving growth now, the likelihood you'll achieve growth later on sort of starts to become less believable. You've got to have a gross margin in your business because ultimately if you don't have a decent gross margin, you're just building a business that ultimately doesn't have a future. And then the final metric's really the cash burn. And businesses like ours Like, we are intentionally having them lose money because you're wanting to fuel growth. So you could choose to not lose money and grow at a slower rate, or you can choose to overinvest in R&D, overinvest in marketing, overinvest in talent, so that you can sort of maximize the opportunity. And it is the same metrics that you'd find in a Coca-Cola, but yeah, they're just different targets, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the biggest things we talk about in terms of leadership at any level in Australia, but I guess most countries, is how do you as a leader connect your team to the mission, to the purpose of the business? And I imagine, I'm not making an assumption here, but you've got a very clear purpose as an organization. Does that play an even bigger part in recruitment retention?
Yeah, it does. I mean, certainly the mission and the purpose of feeding the planet in a way that takes care of the planet is a very unifying sort of catch cry for getting the right people into our business, the right people that care, the right people that are highly motivated. So that's definitely part of it. Although I have to say, when I'm bringing in senior people to the business, while that's a hugely motivating pitch, the thing that gets people as interested, or probably more interested, is just the breadth of career opportunity that coming into a smaller business gives them. So typically I'm bringing in really high potential people who have had functional experience in one area, and they're getting an opportunity to take on a GM role or just a broader cross-functional role, which is really going to help round out their career and set them up for the next step. So like, both of those things are hugely motivating for senior guys in our business.
Yeah, good. And taking that second point, interesting, reflecting on your background, which is diverse, and there's clearly threads through that, such as problem solving. But
yeah,
does that mean you're perhaps more open-minded to those lateral moves, those kind of perceived risks on putting somebody into a role they might not have done before?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm hiring people, like their toolkit to do today's job is important, and their motivation and level of energy and how they're going to approach something is important. But sort of that gets you on a short list with me when it comes to selecting someone. Like, I really want people that are curious. I really want people that can collaborate, and I really want people that can communicate. Because if you can't do those three things, you've got a really limited skill set. But yeah, we've hired some cross-functional people in and taken some risks on them in different roles. But equally, if you're going to front up to Woolies and win business there, you got to know how to deal with Woolies. So it's a bit of a mix. Yeah,
right. Because a lot of our listeners sit in large tier one, structured tier twos. That there's a rhythm and a familiarity to the way in which they do things. When you're in an organization, whether it's private equity, venture capital, it's a very different sort of organization. Describe, I guess, if you could, just the main environmental differences. What does it look and feel like working in a V2 or Darrell Lea compared to a Coke?
Yeah, so I mean, if you take a business like Coke, it's pretty structured. So you'd have a business planning cycle where there'd be a core business plan out the next 3 years. There'd be an annual business plan in much more detail for the next year. And I guess the way I try to explain it to people, that the differences are there's probably a smaller amount of time on strategy and ideation, because you've got to spend quite a lot of time aligning stakeholders, corralling support, pre-messaging and moving things up various levels. And so there's a lot more of that coordination talking. Whereas in a smaller business, you have a real advantage and you don't have to mobilize thousands of people behind one goal. So you can spend more time thinking and more time doing, because you just are lucky that you don't have to coordinate as much. Now, in saying that, there's a difference. So if you front up to trade and you're Unilever or Coke or Nestle, like, you've got impressive toolkit to win. And so, like, no one beats those guys. If they really put themselves behind a goal, like, it's super impressive watching how they go to market. But we've got the tool of agility. And so you got to sort of work out how to amplify that strength. And so they're just different. Like, they're both good. They're just different.
Yeah. It's a kind of really interesting perspective that we try and bring to life for people who are going through career journeys. I think if you can stay in what you're laying the whole time, it's great. You become very, very good at what you do in a tier one. But I think taking that contrast experience out is fantastic, because you're not as we've talked before, Tim, if you take that risk, you don't necessarily giving out what you've done before.
Yeah.
By working in a very different environment, even if you then go back to the large tier 1 or the tier 2,
Yeah,
you're bringing a really different skill set that's going to enable you to think differently and perhaps be even more effective when you go back to the large company.
Yeah, I think it just depends what turns you on. Like, I really love variety of work and challenge, and I find I get a lot more of that in sort of a VC or private equity environment. But equally, there are others that just love, precision and excellence, and certainly you can do all of that in the big guys.
Yeah. You talked about your career in terms of, you moved into, I guess, out of corporate mid-30s, and it felt like the right time for you.
Yeah.
Is there particular moments in someone's career who's not necessarily going to be the CEO, but that might be an eventual goal, but you got there pretty quickly. But for somebody who's perhaps in a more traditional career path, is there periods or times where you think, okay, that's the right time to step out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably a little biased because my career sort of is in, call it 2 parts, where the first part was in really big structured businesses where you had good grad programs and sort of structured learning. And that was fantastic. Like, I learned a lot from my time at Amcor. I learned a hell of a lot in my time in consulting at Ernst & Young, where there's just a lot of formal methodology and process and sort of analysis tools you learn. Coca-Cola was also like that. So again, great toolkit. And if I hadn't done any of that and I just started in a sort of a scrappy startup, I don't think I'd have the toolkit I have today. So I sort of like the idea of starting in the big brands and then moving, once you've got that foundational skill set, into something that you can really accelerate and amplify your sort of career development. But I think it's different for different people. Like, if you're a really proactive, sort of structured person who can manage their own learning and stuff, then maybe you could start day one in a startup and be amazing. But I think it depends on the individual.
Yeah. My instinct says, it's probably aligned with you, I think you need a degree of training and understanding the best way in which things can work.
Yeah.
And that gives you a nice framework to then try new ideas.
Yeah.
And mix it up and challenge it and say, okay, what if we didn't do this or change that? What difference would it make?
Yeah.
But if you start with no concept of what great looks like, it's quite hard. It takes you longer, I think, to get there.
Yeah. Although there are people that when they come out of that structure and you bring them into chaos, they can't first principles solve. So they're just different people are better for different things, to be honest. And I like the journey I've had, and I'd encourage it for people. Yeah. I think it depends on who you are.
Yeah, it does. And I think sometimes, I do get approached to somebody who's perhaps been in a big company, a tier 1 for 20, 25 years. And your instinct says, oh, you're never going to manage. But actually, maybe they can.
Yeah.
Because they can problem solve, and actually they've been really agitative and quite creative in that big company. So I think we get a little bit biased sometimes on assuming that, you've got to go there early. You don't necessarily have to. I think to your point, it's up to the individual.
Yeah. I think a lot of people get caught up with the sort of the excitement of, I want to be entrepreneurial. I want to work in a startup. And then they get there and it's confronting, it's exciting, it's terrifying, it's everything. And so you've got to be someone who can love that level of ambiguity. And if you can, it's a brilliant place to play. But if you can't, you got to be able to sleep at night. And so you got to decide sort of what's right for you.
That's a really nice summing up of it, actually. Yeah. Moving towards the end of the pod, Tim, if you could, I guess, distill down all your career experience so far to one piece of real digestible career advice for the listeners, what would it be?
I don't know if I've got one piece of advice, but
I'll give you a couple if you need more. Yeah.
I mean, what I would say is, where you can, seek out and work with the best people you can, and you'll have more fun and you'll enjoy the experience and learn more along the way. I think if you can find transformational opportunities, all I could say is look for them, because if you're going to be in a job and do an amazing effort and you're going to move things by 0.1%, or you can go and do something transformational and do the same amount of smart work and get a transformational high impact result. Why wouldn't you want to do that? So I think really look for those opportunities. I talked about curiosity. I just think the more questions you ask and the more interested you are in trying to get to the sort of the crux of a problem, there's so much opportunity out there if you just look for it. And I think whether that's in a business you're in or trying to find a business that you want to work for, I think that's really important. And then there's just one piece of advice that I got years ago. And it's like, whenever you're in a tough career sort of decision point, just what would you do if you weren't afraid? And I've always loved that advice. And I've definitely had moments like the Unistraw change where I was probably scared to do that change, but I knew it was the thing I had to do. And I think if you can just go, what's the right thing to do if you weren't worried about the fear of failure, I just think it's a good way to live by.
What a nice piece of advice to take to life. I think fear creates inertia in a lot of people a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Guys, that's a great piece of advice. Tim, thanks for sharing today.
Sure.
Really enjoyed the conversation. I think some great
it's been fun.
Great takeaways. Love the journey. And guys, thanks to you all for listening as always. Really interesting career journey. And, I can't wait to see how the listeners respond to that, Tim. I think we'll get some pretty good downloads. Next up in the pod, we're meeting by sheer coincidence. So you probably don't know this, Tim, unless she's told you, one of your team. So Jade Licious coming on alongside Jane King from Woolies. Jen and Jade are alumni of the Marketing Academy, so you've got some good marketers in your business. Now, that's an organization that takes some of the best marketers and equips them with the tools to really forge a pathway to the top of their profession. So we're going to explore the Marketing Academy, how it works, and whether it could be of interest to you as one of our listeners. So looking forward to that session. So until next time, thanks again, Tim.
Thanks, Mike. It's been fun.
And for me, Mike Dixon, keep listening to our podcast to help your future in sales and marketing. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast from XR Recruitment and Search. We're passionate about helping you get the most out of your sales and marketing career. Keep listening as we bring you more career insights and advice from Australia's top sales and marketing leaders. You just can't get this career advice anywhere else. My name is Mike Dixon. See you next time on Your Future in Sales and Marketing.